Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Roseman. Today, we're going to begin looking at a series of three early 20th century revolutions, beginning with the Mexican Revolution that took place between 1910 and 1920. Do not get this confused with the first Mexican Revolution, which was essentially an independence movement by Mexicans against Spain. This is more so a civil war in terms of revolution that had major repercussions, not just in Latin America, but in other areas of the world as well. So again, this is 1910 to 1920s or 1920, and later on we'll take a look at the Russian Revolution and the Chinese Revolution, all of which overlap one another. What I'm going to do is give you a quick overview of causes of the Mexican Revolution, and it will be your job to look at outcomes of the Mexican Revolution. So some things to consider here. The causes were building up over time, really stretching back to the beginnings, the foundations of the nation of Mexico itself. But we're going to focus in on the time frame of 1876 approximately to 1910 in terms of the causes of the Mexican Revolution. For one, if you remember, despite the fact that Mexico referred to itself as a republic, just like most Latin American nations after independence was gained in the last century, hardly any of those Latin American nations were actually based on Enlightenment ideals, very few of which were. Instead, like most Latin American nations, Mexico had a government guided by authoritarianism, so one person dominating politics. Do you remember the name of or the term for those Latin American rulers that claimed dictatorial powers, usually from the Creole class? They would sweep in promising reforms, but then once established, became basically military dictators. If you said caudillos, you were exactly right. And from 1876 to 1910, Mexico was guided by one particular caudillo named Porfirio Diaz. Took the title of president, but essentially, again, he was a caudillo, a dictator. And though there were presidential elections, they were almost all rigged, backed by Creole supporters who gained great benefits from his rule, as well as the United States, which we know is a major imperialistic power in Latin America, particularly with our southern neighbor. As further evidence of how corrupt Diaz was and acted as a caudillo, political opponents, and that means anybody that spoke out against him, he would jail, and that included a person that ran against him for the office of president in 1910, a man named Francisco Madero. So keep in mind, this guy, he says that he's doing good for the Mexican people, but he's in cahoots with the Creole minority, who dominates land and the resources, which brings us to the next major point. In Mexico, a small minority of the population dominated the economic resources and the political structure of Mexico, in addition to foreigners, especially U.S. business interests there. Its land, though Mexico is really rich in terms of agricultural land and mining resources, very few people in Mexico actually own that land. And one way we see that is through the continuation of the hacienda system. If you recall back to the colonial period of Latin America, one of the major labor institutions that developed alongside mining systems and plantation systems were haciendas. These were large estates owned by, or usually by, Creole elites, and they originated in that colonial era, as I said before. They acted as a major rural institution. So it basically functioned kind of like a miniature feudal structure in Mexico. It basically functioned in a way by keeping peasants, who were usually in Mexico Amerindians and mestizos, working on the land in heavy debt in some way or another to the Creole landowners, so they could not leave that land they were working on. So landlords, therefore, like we'll see also in China at this time, before their revolution, dominated the countryside of Mexico. So this kept the vast majority of the population impoverished, and we'll get to that in a few moments. Going hand in hand with that was American or United States neo-colonialism. So this is a new term we need to throw out here. So neo, we know, means new, and colonialism is those attitudes of foreign control over foreign resources that don't technically belong to them. And we saw that extensively in the way that the United States businesses had increasingly through the mid to late 1800s into the early 1900s were busy investing in the natural resources of Mexico. Can you remember what some of those were? If you said oil, that's exactly right. And if you recall, another way we see neocolonialism throughout Latin America, despite the fact that Latin American nations are technically independent, they come under the influence of major core nations like the United States. One way we see that is that a lot of the foreign infrastructure of Mexico and other Latin American nations was foreign owned, namely railroads in particular. And Diaz supported this because that meant investors in his nation, which meant money into the pockets of Creoles, which included his key backers, politically speaking. All right, so there's growing resentment by the general Mexican population who are impoverished, who see as the source of their root or the root of their problems as the Creoles and the United States. It's symbolized by this continued dictatorship by Porfirio Diaz. All right, so all these things are mounting up against that vast majority of mestizos and Amerindians in Mexico. Mexico is highly underdeveloped economically, with very little industrialization, though Diaz would time and time again proclaim that advancement was being made in Mexico largely because of actions by the Creole population and these U.S. investors. But what it really boils down to is a lack of opportunities economically, socially, educationally for that lower class. And all the while, the lower population demanding access and control over their own land and resources for their claim that they have never had access to Enlightenment freedoms, such as suffrage, no true freedoms of speech. And that is made clear whenever Francisco Madero in 1910 calls for revolution against Porfirio Diaz after being locked up as a result of failed promises by Diaz to hold a free and open election. So what results between 1910 and 1920 in Mexico is generally all hell breaking loose. Mexico splits into lots of different factional groups, all vying for national power. So even though in the short term Diaz is overthrown as an authoritarian dictator or caudillo, it also opens up further problems in the long term for the next 10 years at least, of who's really in control of Mexico. So we'll see the rise of local revolutionary leaders like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, who all proclaim rights, demand rights for the general impoverished lower class population who make up that majority of Mexico. So one of the things you're going to do next is take a look at one of those factional revolutionary leaders, Emiliano Zapata, and read his document called the Plan de Ayala, which he wrote in 1911, which is basically a complaint letter, a letter of criticism about the current situation in Mexico as of 1911. So there he is, Emiliano Zapata, and with that, you're going to move on to that next phase of looking at major effects of the Mexican Revolution.